When a policeman finds a baby crying in the garbage, he doesn't hesitate to rescue her, but soon realizes that she was exactly what was missing in his life. He begins the formal adoption process, and years later he gets the biggest fright of his life. The high-pitched sound of crying pierced the early morning air, breaking the monotony of the empty street. John, exhausted after another exhausting shift at the police station, hardly paid any attention to the noise coming from the dumpster. At first he thought it was rats, common in that dirty area, rummaging through garbage bags in search of food. But on instinct, he stopped, his body tensing as he heard that sound again. It wasn't a mouse, it wasn't a hungry cat. It was something more fragile, something more human. John's heart pounded harder in his chest, an irrational fear invading him. He knew what he had heard, but his brain refused the idea. Couldn't it be a baby, he thought. His mind raced, but his feet moved before he could understand. He ran to the garbage can, ignoring the tiredness that overwhelmed his body, and began to rummage through the bags with desperate urgency. His hands trembled as he pulled apart layers of plastic and debris until finally his eyes found a dirty pink blanket tucked in among the garbage. Inside, something was moving. Time seemed to stop at that moment. John stood frozen, his mind struggling to accept what his eyes were seeing. With an almost mechanical movement, he pulled open the small package, and there it was, a baby, so small, so helpless, her face wrinkled from crying, her skin stained with dirt, and her floral pajamas soiled. John lifted her carefully, feeling her light weight in his arms. The crying, until then loud and insistent, began to subside. For a few seconds, he could only stare at the baby's face. Her breath caught in her chest as a mixture of shock and compassion took over every cell in his body. She had no one. No one to hold her, to protect her. Thrown away like garbage. The thought burned in John's mind, stoking a silent and growing anger. Who could do something like that? He couldn't conceive of the horror of the situation. His rough, dirty fingers gently touched the girl's face, and for a brief moment, she opened her eyes and stared at the man who had just saved her life. In that instant, something changed in John. He felt a deep, inexplicable connection. That child, abandoned in the garbage, represented much more than a police case. With the baby now asleep in his arms, John knew he couldn't just leave her behind. He held her tightly, feeling the fragile warmth against his chest, as if he were holding his own future in his hands. As he walked towards the car, a wave of conflicting thoughts hit him. It wasn't just the baby he was saving. Something deeper and more personal was being born there. At the moment, he had no way of knowing, but that little life he had rescued from the trash would change his forever. John drove to the hospital with the baby on his lap, his heart racing and his mind still trying to process what had just happened. The streets, still dark and empty, passed by like blurs as he gripped the steering wheel, feeling the weight of responsibility increase by the minute. The crying had stopped, and the little girl was quiet, nestled against his chest, as if she already knew she was safe. But John couldn't allow himself to relax. The question on his mind was brutal and constant. Who could do this to a baby? At the hospital, the staff on duty quickly mobilized when they saw him enter with the child. While the nurses took her away for an assessment, John stood in the waiting room, watching the minutes pass with an anxiety he hadn't felt since his tense days at the police academy. From a distance, he could see the little girl being examined. The cold hospital lights and the sound of the monitors contrasted with the warmth he felt holding the child. She looked so fragile, but at the same time, there was an invisible strength there, a kind of resilience, as if she had been fighting since the moment she was abandoned. "She's fine, sir. No signs of serious injury," said one of the nurses approaching. The information brought relief, but along with it came a new fear. What now? He looked at the baby, lying in a makeshift crib, too small to understand the cruel world around her. With no one to pick her up, her fate was virtually certain. An orphanage, a system John knew too well to trust. He crossed his arms, his eyes fixed on the girl. His chest heaved with the memories he was always trying to bury. Years ago, his heart had been destroyed by a betrayal that left him in pieces, unable to trust anyone again. The pain had pushed him away from everything and everyone, isolating himself in a job that drained his energy but left his heart empty. Until now. That baby, helpless and lost, was stirring something he thought had been buried forever. As the thoughts swirled in his mind, a social worker appeared, explaining to him that if the parents were not found, the baby would be taken into the adoption system. John listened, but his mind was already elsewhere. He felt an impulse growing inside him, a decision that seemed to form without him needing to reflect much. The truth was that this little girl didn't deserve an uncertain fate, bouncing from house to house, not knowing who really cared about her. She needed someone, and suddenly John realized that maybe he needed someone too. "I want to adopt her," the words came out before he could stop himself. The social worker looked at him in surprise. It was rare for someone to make a decision like that so quickly. John knew that. He himself was shocked by her determination, but deep down something screamed that it was right. More right than anything else he had done in recent years. There was a void in his life, and that baby somehow seemed to fill it. The social worker tried to explain the procedures, the difficulties, the time needed, but none of it mattered. John was prepared to face whatever was necessary. The checks, the bureaucracy, everything seemed irrelevant in the face of the certainty that was growing inside him. That baby was his. He would give her everything he had because somehow she had also rescued something inside him, a spark of hope that he had thought was extinct. As the night drew to a close and the sun began to rise over the horizon, John looked at the baby once more, now already asleep. Her name would come later. The formal process would be long, but at that moment, one thing was clear. He had found something he didn't know he was looking for. And she, even without knowing it, had found a father. The days that followed seemed like a whirlwind. Between the adoption papers, the background checks, and the trips to the hospital to monitor the baby's condition, John barely had time to breathe. He moved forward as if on autopilot, driven by a force that even he didn't fully understand. Every time he looked at that little girl, now called Emily, something inside him grew stronger. A silent certainty that he was on the right path, even if the world around him seemed like chaos. The adoption process was long and arduous. Each bureaucratic step seemed like an insurmountable challenge, a barrier that required patience and persistence. John had never been a man of easy emotions. His past, marked by Sarah's betrayal, had hardened his heart. He avoided deep connections, and his relationships were limited to work. But Emily broke through that armor without even trying. And as he fought the system to ensure that she was his daughter, the feeling of responsibility grew, as did the fear of failure. Days turned into weeks, and John now had Emily officially in his temporary care. Every time he came home after long shifts at the police station, he found her asleep in the small crib he had improvised in his apartment. She looked so fragile, but at the same time he knew she was a fighter. She had already survived the worst, and now it was his responsibility to ensure that her future was different. Being a single parent, however, wasn't easy. John felt exhausted in ways he had never experienced before. It wasn't just the work, it was the constant pressure to live up to this new responsibility, to be the father Emily needed. At first he stumbled over the routines, changing diapers, preparing bottles, dealing with crying in the middle of the night. It was all new to him. There were times when he felt lost, unable to do enough. He didn't know how to be a father, and it ate him up inside. Whenever he saw Emily crying and couldn't calm her down straight away, despair took over. He wondered if he was ready for it, if he wasn't just messing up that little girl's life even more. At work, things had also changed. His colleagues, who had always seen him as the tough, ruthless cop, now looked at him with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Some offered to help, recommending nurseries and even offering to cover his night shifts. John's boss, a rigid man of few words, called him into his office one day. John expected a reprimand for his occasional absences and obvious distraction. But to his surprise, the boss simply said, "We're all rooting for you." The unexpected support of his colleagues gave John the breath he needed. He wasn't alone on this journey, and that comforted him, even though the emotional burden was heavy. Watching Emily grow up, even in those first few months, brought him a joy he hadn't felt for a long time. With each new smile, each shy giggle, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten, even if only for a few moments. Before long, John found himself planning her future. He began to think about the school she would attend, the trips they would take together, the moments they would experience as father and daughter. The first time Emily called him Daddy was a moment he would never forget. The words, still shaky and barely formed, came from her lips like a punch straight to his heart. He froze for a moment, his gaze fixed on the little girl, feeling an overwhelming wave of emotion. Until then, he had seen himself as a guardian, someone who had saved that child from abandonment. But now everything changed. She saw him as a father. Somehow he had earned that place in her heart, and it shook him in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the legal responsibility, the role of caregiver. Now it was something much deeper. He was Emily's father, and that meant the world to him. However, the shadow of John's past still loomed. At night, when the house was silent and Emily was fast asleep, he found himself alone with his thoughts. The ghost of Sarah, of the betrayal that had destroyed him years before, still haunted his mind. He inevitably thought of her and wondered if somehow life was giving him another chance. But the pain of the past was hard to forget. Sarah was the only woman he had ever loved. And when she betrayed him, she took with her his ability to trust, to open up again. And now there was Emily, a child who depended on him in a way he had never experienced before. Try as he might, John couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was yet to come. Every time he looked at Emily, fear invaded him. He couldn't fail her. He couldn't let her face any more suffering. The weight of this responsibility overwhelmed him, and he knew that one way or another, his life would never be the same. But deep down in his heart, despite his fears and insecurities, there was something stronger. Something he had never felt so clearly. Love. An unshakable love that would make him move mountains for that girl. The years passed, and John's routine with Emily had, in a way, stabilized. He raised her with all the love he had, trying to compensate for the lack of a mother with his unconditional dedication. But still, doubts consumed him in silence. Was he being enough? Was Emily missing something? Someone? No matter how hard he tried, John knew he couldn't be everything to her. This bothered him deeply, especially when he saw other fathers taking their children to school hand in hand with their mothers. Emily never mentioned the absence of a mother, but he saw in her eyes the same question he asked himself every night. However, John was methodical and determined. He made sure Emily had the best, a good education, extracurricular activities, and, whenever he could, he tried to give her moments of happiness that would erase any shadow of sadness. Weekends were filled with walks in the park, visits to the zoo, and short trips out of town. They were the only moments when John could really switch off his mind from work and worries. Seeing Emily's smile running through the grass, her hair fluttering in the wind, brought him a peace he had never experienced before becoming a father. But even in these small joys, fear was always present. John couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was always lurking. Every night that he put Emily to bed, he felt the weight of a crushing responsibility, as if fate was about to pull the rug from under his feet. He knew he was running away from any possibility of a new relationship, not for lack of opportunities, but because something inside him was still broken. He had closed himself off to the world since Sarah, and now with Emily in his life, he couldn't risk anyone else hurting him again. The pain of losing her to someone else was an unbearable thought. Emily's 10th birthday was approaching, and with it, a mixture of anxiety and joy. John wanted to make that day unforgettable. He had promised her a trip to Africa, a safari adventure that she had talked about since she was a little girl fascinated by animals. For months, he had saved and planned every detail, eager to give her this experience that he knew would change their lives. For him, it was more than just a trip. It was a symbol of how much he had achieved for her, of how they had overcome so many obstacles together. But life rarely goes according to plan. On the fateful day of the school trip, John was working at the police station when the phone rang. Deep down, something in him already knew. Perhaps it was the desperate tone of the voice on the other end of the line, or the way his heart raced before he even answered. The accident happened in the blink of an eye. The school bus, the overturned truck. The school principal's words were vague, confusing, but all he could make out was Emily's name and the word hospital. The world around John went dark. His body went into autopilot as he ran to the car. The minutes to the hospital seemed like hours, and with every second his dread grew. He drove as if he were being chased by his worst fears, sweat pouring down his face, the knot in his throat so tight he could barely breathe. All he could think about was the promise he had made to her, the trip they would never take if anything happened. And now he found himself on the verge of losing the only thing that mattered. When he arrived at the hospital, reality hit him like a punch. The automatic doors opened to reveal chaos. Doctors rushing around, injured people being attended to, and in the middle of it all, Emily, her daughter, unconscious, connected to tubes and machines that kept her alive. The shock paralyzed him. There in front of him, his little girl seemed so small, so vulnerable. The wounds on her face, the bruises, everything seemed a cruel irony for someone so young, so full of life. John fell to his knees beside Emily's bed, his hands trembling as he gently stroked her forehead. The doctor's words echoed in his mind. Critical condition, coma, frontal impact. All he knew was that she was there, but far away from his arms, from his love. The pain he felt at that moment was greater than anything he had ever faced. Neither Sarah's betrayal nor the years of loneliness had prepared John for this. He felt as if his heart was being ripped out of his chest. The weeks that followed were an endless nightmare. John didn't leave the hospital, refusing to go home, to live a life without her. The hospital put a bed for him next to Emily, but he hardly slept. He spent hours reading to her, talking about the trip they were going to take, promising that everything would be all right. Every word he said was meant to calm her down, but deep down he knew it was more for himself. He needed to believe that she would wake up. He needed to believe that he wouldn't lose her. But the days went by, and with them, hope began to fade. The doctors began to put pressure on him to make a decision, talking about quality of life, about letting Emily go in peace. But John couldn't. He couldn't. How could he give up on her? How could anyone expect him to simply turn off the machines and accept that his daughter, that little girl he had rescued from the trash, and who had become the center of his life, wasn't coming back? He couldn't stand it, and he wouldn't give up. John refused to believe that this was the end. Every time a doctor entered the room with a heavy gaze, ready for another conversation about difficult decisions, he cut them off before they could finish. He repeated the same words. She'll wake up. It had become almost a mantra, a silent prayer that he repeated to himself day after day. He had to believe it, because the alternative was unbearable. He spent his time talking to Emily, telling her stories about when she was little, how she had changed his life. He read her favorite books, the ones with the worn covers, trying to connect with any part of her mind, hoping that a word or phrase would bring her back. But as the weeks dragged on, despair grew. He wanted to believe that she was fighting, that she could hear him. But the truth was that the silence of the room, interrupted only by the monotonous beeps of the machines, began to weigh like a sentence. John began to leave the room briefly, but even in those minutes outside, he couldn't escape the dread that consumed him. His conversations with the nurses, which had once been full of hope, were now reduced to looks of compassion. He knew what they were thinking. He knew what the doctors were discussing behind closed doors. It was only a matter of time. The word irreversible was beginning to echo in the corridors. One night, as I watched Emily lying in bed, a shadow of doubt began to creep in. What if they were right? What if there was no turning back? As much as he fought it, the fear that she would never wake up began to eat away at his resolve. That night, John cried like he hadn't cried since he had found Emily, so many years before, abandoned in the trash. The tears fell silently as he held his daughter's hand, cold and still, as if clinging to her could somehow prevent the inevitable. On Emily's 10th birthday, John forced himself to act as if everything was fine, even though his heart was in pieces. He brought a cake to the hospital, along with a heart-shaped balloon and a stuffed dog. She had always wanted a dog, but he hadn't been able to give her one yet. As the doctors and nurses passed through the room, he forced a smile, an empty gesture to try to keep up the facade. But deep down, he knew he was living a farce. Emily was there, But she wasn't. And John found himself unable to go on, pretending that everything would be all right. It was that night, at the exact moment when it was 10 years since he had found her in the trash, that John fell into a deep sleep, emotionally and physically exhausted. He dreamt of the day he rescued her, the smell of garbage, the muffled sound of her crying. But this time, in the dream, he couldn't get her out of the garbage can. He tried, but she was still out of his reach, sinking deeper and deeper. Suddenly, a soft sound woke him up. Something different. He blinked, trying to get his bearings in the dark room. And then he realized the sound was coming from Emily, a faint moan, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. John jumped out of bed, his heart racing. He rushed to her side, his eyes wide, unable to believe what was happening. His fingers trembled as he touched his daughter's arm, which to his surprise began to move slowly. She was waking up. The doctors were rushed in, the lights in the room came on, and, in a matter of minutes, the small room was full of nurses and equipment. But John couldn't take his eyes off Emily. There she was, opening her eyes slowly, as if she had spent an eternity in a dark and distant world. The relief was so overwhelming that John could hardly breathe. His daughter was back. He had made it. Against all expectations, she was fighting her way back to him. But then something broke the moment of euphoria. Emily's eyes, now fully open, were filled with confusion. She looked around the room at the doctors and nurses, and finally her eyes settled on John. But there was no recognition there. The smile of relief on his face disappeared when he saw her blank stare. Who are you?" Emily's voice came out weak, but each word was like a knife driven into John's heart. He stopped, completely frozen, unable to process what he had just heard. That moment he had waited for weeks. The miracle he had longed for had turned into a nightmare in a matter of seconds. Emily didn't know who he was. She, his daughter, the one he had saved from abandonment, the one he had raised with all the love and dedication he had, now looked at him like a stranger. John felt his world come crashing down again. He had spent weeks by her side, fighting for her life, and now it was as if it had all been for nothing. He had rescued his daughter, but at the same time, he had lost her in a way he could never have imagined. The days that followed Emily's awakening were a cruel mixture of relief and pain for John. The miracle he had prayed for had happened. His daughter was alive, breathing unaided, but the reality he now faced was devastating. Emily didn't remember him. Her eyes, which had once gazed at him with such affection, now looked at him cautiously, as if he were a stranger. At first, the doctors tried to reassure him. They explained that memory loss and confusion were common in cases like Emily's. They said that her brain had been damaged for a long time. They said that her brain had been through an extreme trauma, and that, with time, the memories might come back. But the could echoed in John's mind like a hard blow. Nothing was guaranteed. Emily was there, but the connection between them, built up with so much love and dedication over 10 years, seemed to have been erased. Every morning, he arrived at the hospital hopeful, trying to hide his pain. He would read to her, bring her toys that she used to love, in the hope of awakening some memory. But Emily remained distant, always polite, but clearly uncomfortable in his presence. It was as if John was a strange piece in a puzzle that she couldn't put together. She accepted his help, chatted, but without any sign of familiarity. He was just the man who stood by her bedside, claiming to be her father. The worst part was hearing the doctors, nurses, and visitors refer to him as Dad, and seeing Emily's face contract in confusion. She looked at him uncertainly, as if trying to understand how this man could be someone so important in her life without her knowing. Every time this happened, John felt a stab. Every word of father sounded empty, devoid of the bond they shared. Even with the doctor's advice, John felt his despair growing. He became more isolated, avoiding even his friends at the police station who tried to offer support. He was a broken man, trying to hold on to what was left of his daughter, not knowing how to bring her back. The nights in hospital seemed endless, and nightmares began to invade what little sleep he could get. Nightmares in which Emily looked at him with the same empty, distant eyes, always asking, "Who are you?" John would spend hours sitting beside her bed, looking at his daughter who, in many ways, was no longer the same. He would try to remember happy times, like her first steps, the nights when he rocked her to sleep, or the first time she called him daddy. Now all that seemed distant, like a memory of a life he might never recover. There were times when he wondered if anything could mend what had been broken. One day, while he was once again reading one of Emily's favorite books, she interrupted him in a soft, hesitant voice. "Are you really my father?" she asked, looking directly into his eyes for the first time in days. The question, simple and direct, cut John deeply. He swallowed, fighting the emotion that rose in his throat. He didn't want her to see how much it was destroying him, but at the same time, he didn't know how to hide the pain. He couldn't lie, but he didn't want to pressure her either. "Yes, Emily," he replied, his voice trembling. "I'm your father. I've always been with you, since the day I met you." But the confusion was still in her eyes. She frowned, desperately trying to grasp onto something that her mind simply couldn't access. I, I don't remember," she whispered, her eyes beginning to glisten with tears. John wanted to touch her, to comfort her, but the fear of pushing her further away paralyzed him. He wanted to shout that everything would be all right, but he wasn't sure he believed it. He was watching helplessly as his daughter slipped away from him in a way that not even the doctors could fix. And at that moment, he realized that perhaps the worst fear of all was not that she would never wake up, but that she would never remember who he was. The days continued to pass, and slowly, very slowly, John began to notice small signs of change. Sometimes it was a look, sometimes a word she used. But then one day, while he was reading to her, something happened. Emily looked at him and said, almost without thinking, "I remember that book. You used to read it to me when I was little, didn't you?" It was a small breakthrough, almost insignificant, but for John, it was like a ray of light in the midst of darkness. His heart raced and he fought not to cry in front of her. She remembered. Even if it was just a detail, a piece of memory, it was enough to rekindle his hope. He clung to that moment as if his life depended on it. Maybe, just maybe, he could still bring his daughter back. But he knew the road would be long and painful. Every day he had to deal with the uncertainty, with the possibility that Emily would never recover all the memories that connected them. And even if she did, there was no guarantee that she would be the same child he knew and loved. John was stuck in an emotional limbo, struggling to keep hope alive, while facing the harsh reality that they might never have the same bond as before. Only time would tell. John clung to that thread of hope like a man holding on to the edge of an abyss. Every little memory that came back to Emily felt like a breath of fresh air after weeks of suffocation. She remembered bits and pieces, moments, small things like the sound of a song he used to put her to sleep to, or the taste of the ice cream they always ordered together. But the most important memories, the ones that formed the basis of their relationship, were still out of reach. John prepared himself for the worst, while desperately trying to hold on to any spark of reconnection. But there was one truth that John still didn't have the heart to tell Emily, a truth he had been holding in since the day he found her in the trash. She had been adopted. He had put this moment off for years, always waiting for the right time, the ideal moment to explain to her that biologically he wasn't her father. But now, with everything that had happened, the revelation seemed even more complicated. He knew he had to be honest, but the fear of losing her, of her pulling away even more when she found out, terrified him. One night, while watching Emily sleep, John made a decision. He knew that the truth could no longer be put off. As difficult as it was, he couldn't build a relationship with her based on lies, even though the truth could be devastating. The next morning, he took her to a park, the same one they used to go to when she was younger. They sat on a bench, the silence between them filled only by the distant sounds of children playing. "Emily," he began, his voice hesitant, "there's something I need to tell you. Something important about the day we met." She looked at him curiously, but unhurriedly, as if ready to hear whatever it was. John felt his heart racing, each word weighing like lead in his throat. I, I'm not your biological father," he said at once, feeling the weight of the truth fall between them. "I found you. You were abandoned, and I rescued you. I've loved you since that day, but I never told you that you were adopted." The silence that followed was unbearable. John watched her face, waiting for any sign of anger, confusion, sadness, but Emily simply stared at him, processing what she had just heard. She blinked a few times, as if reorganizing everything in her mind. John felt the fear rise to the surface, that fear that had been tormenting him since she woke up, that of losing his daughter, now that everything was out in the open. But then she did something he hadn't expected. Emily took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his, and took a deep breath. "That doesn't change anything, does it?" she said, her voice calm, but full of a maturity he had never noticed before. "You're still my father." Her words completely disarmed John. He felt his eyes fill with tears, tears he had held back for so long. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Emily, even without all the memories, recognized the bond they had, the bond that went beyond blood, beyond any past history. She knew deep in her heart that John would always be her father, regardless of how the story had begun. Time passed, and although not all of Emily's memories returned, she began to adjust to the new reality. Little moments of reconnection appeared here and there, but in the end, John realized that he didn't need her to remember everything. Their love was built in the present, and that was what mattered most. She saw him as the father he had always been, and that was enough for him. One day, while they were having dinner, Emily suddenly asked, "What about the safari? You said we were going to Africa, remember?" John, taken aback, realized that that promise, made before the accident, was still alive in her mind. Even with everything they had been through, she still wanted that trip, that adventure he had promised. And at that moment, he knew it was time to move forward, to make that promise come true. John wasted no time. He organized everything quickly, and a few weeks later, they boarded a flight to Africa. Emily's excitement was palpable, and for the first time in a long time, John felt like he was really breathing again. It was as if that trip symbolized a new beginning, a way to leave behind the suffering and embrace the future he had always wanted for them. But when they landed at the African airport, what was supposed to be the start of a new adventure quickly turned into a nightmare. John, still holding Emily's hand, was suddenly surrounded by police officers. They were shouting in a language he didn't understand, and before he could react, he was thrown to the ground and handcuffed. Emily screamed, frightened, as she was separated from him. Panic seized John. What was going on? What had he done? As the police dragged him away, everything began to click in John's mind. They had mistaken him for a child trafficker, someone who was wanted all over Africa. Because he was traveling with a child who, in their eyes, was not his biological daughter, he seemed to fit the criminal profile. He tried to argue, to show his documents, but the police wouldn't listen. To them, everything indicated that he was the man they were looking for. Emily was taken to a temporary shelter, and John was thrown into a cell. He felt powerless, devastated. All the progress he had made, all the emotional scars he had overcome, now seemed insignificant in the face of the brutality of the situation. He feared what might happen to Emily, now alone, without understanding why her father had been taken away. Worse still, he knew that the truth would be revealed. A DNA test would confirm that Emily was not biologically his daughter. But contrary to his expectations, the DNA test brought a shocking revelation. Emily was his biological daughter. That was impossible. John had found Emily in the trash. He knew with absolute certainty that she was not his daughter by blood. Confused and stunned, John was released by the authorities. But the mystery remained. When they returned to the United States, he decided to have another DNA test carried out by a laboratory he trusted. And, to his surprise, the result was the same. Emily was his biological daughter. The only plausible explanation was that Sarah, his ex-fiancée, had become pregnant shortly before he discovered her betrayal and left him. She must have given birth in secret and abandoned the girl without him ever knowing. The revelation, although shocking, brought a strange sense of relief to John. Somehow, fate had brought the two of them together again, and that was all that mattered. Emily had always been his daughter, in his heart, and he now knew, in his blood too. When he told Emily about everything, she listened attentively, And in the end, she hugged him tightly, as if she already knew what he had always wanted to say. "You've always been my father," she said, with the same certainty as before. And at that moment, John knew that, despite all the obstacles and all the pain they had faced, he and Emily were destined to be together. No matter what path had led them there, they were and always would be father and daughter.